Assalamu alaikum students, welcome to the second lecture of Cultural Anthropology. I am going to be continuing with the substance of the first lecture and try to introduce some other important aspects of cultural anthropology to you today, which will then form the substance of the remaining lectures. Now, if you recall from the last time, essentially we had introduced and spoken about and thought about the idea of cultural anthropology and what anthropologists are and what they tried, the different types of anthropologists try to do in the world, and that is essentially they try to look at human behavior and the way that human beings live, think, act, and exist in the world. Now, today what I'm going to try and do is introduce you to some very fundamental aspects of culture. This is going to still be a part of a continuation of the first lecture, and the first lecture and today's lecture is going to basically provide a general basic introduction to the idea of cultural anthropology. And based on these two lectures of today, you would have, in one form or the other, in one sentence or the other, have gotten clues as to the kinds of issues that will be explored in much greater detail in the remaining lectures. So now I will try and focus in on the current issue at hand, and that is the concept of culture and the application of cultural anthropology. Now, इससे पहले कि मैं आपको मज़ीद कल्चर के बारे में डिटेल्स दूं, मैं सिर्फ आपको एक जनरल सी मिसाल देता हूं. वो ये है कि कल्चर जो है वो जो एंथ्रोपोलॉजी का जो फोकस है वो कल्चर में है. जिस तरह मिसाल के तौर पे अगर पॉलिटिकल साइंस है तो पॉलिटिकल साइंस में ज़्यादातर फोकस जो है वो इश्यूज ऑफ पावर पर है. दैट इज द प्राइमरी focus of political science, to look at the various forms of power, how political parties, how individuals exert power in the form of political parties, in the form of political agitation when it comes to that. And essentially it is the basic principle of political science is to look at the issue of power. Similarly, sociology looks at society, at how societies function, at what societies do. Economics looks at production, consumption, distribution, and how people basically, the kinds of issues that are involved in their economic welfare. So cultural anthropology, what cultural anthropology is doing is looking at culture. It is looking at the idea of culture, the importance of culture, the value of culture. Now, culture includes everything that people have, think, do as members of a society. All people have a culture. अब इसका कहने का ये मकसद है कि बेसिकली हर इंसान जो है वो उसका कोई ना कोई कल्चर है. I mean, वैसे अगर आप अंग्रेजी की यूसेज में देखें या आप हमारी यूसेज में देखें तो उससे कई बार ये तासुर होता है कि कल्चर जो है वो सिर्फ रिफाइंड लोगों के पास कल्चर होता है. अब जिस तरह मिसाल के तौर पे कहते हैं जी ये बड़ा कल्चर्ड इंसान है, इसको तो आर्ट्स के बारे में पता है, लिटरेचर के बारे में पता है, तो ये बड़ा कल्चर्ड इंसान है. यानी कि वो एक एलीट तबका है जिसको इन चीजों के बारे में पता है और उसकी वजह से उस इंसान के पास कल्चर है. अब जो कल्चरल एंथ्रोपोलॉजिस्ट है वो कल्चर को इस तरह नहीं देखता. टू अ कल्चरल एंथ्रोपोलॉजिस्ट द आइडिया ऑफ कल्चर इज वेरी डिफरेंट. इट इज बेसिकली एनी पर्सन हु थिंक्स, who acts and who behaves in a certain manner has culture. So by this definition, हर इंसान का culture है, चाहे वो sophisticated culture हो, चाहे वो unsophisticated culture हो, चाहे वो अफ्रीका में रहे या इंडोनेशिया में रहे या चाइना में रहे या जापान में रहे या इंग्लैंड में रहे, हर इंसान का, चाहे वो इन इलाकों के अंदर रूरल एरियाज में हो, अर्बन एरियाज में हो, हर इंसान का कल्चर है. सो ये सबसे जो अहम बात है कल्चर के बारे में वो ये है कि ऑल पीपल हैव कल्चर एंड दैट कल्चर इज डिफाइंड बाय द आइडिया ऑफ द काइंड्स ऑफ बिहेवियर दैट पीपल हैव and what they think, what they do, and what they have. That defines their culture. The second aspect of culture is that it comprises of material objects, ideas, values, attitudes, and patterned ways of behaving. What this point is trying to get across to you is that culture जो है वो एक patterned तरीका है. अब culture इस्तेमाल तो हम बड़ी आसानी से इसको कर लेते हैं कल्चर के आइडिया को, मगर इस आइडिया के पीछे जो फलसफा है, जो इसकी डेफिनेशन है कल्चर की, बिलखसूस कल्चरल एंथ्रोपोलॉजी के लिहाज से, वो ये है कि एक कल्चर्ड पैटर्न है जिसको कल्चर डिफाइन कर रहा है. सो इसमें यह है कि आपके मटीरियल ऑब्जेक्ट्स शामिल हो जाते हैं. अब मटीरियल ऑब्जेक्ट्स, इफ यू रिमेंबर फ्रॉम द लास्ट लेक्चर, were objects that can be seen, can be felt, can be tangibly dealt with. अब आर्कियोलॉजिस्ट जो हैं वो अगर आर्कियोलॉजिकल डिग पर जाते थे और एक्सकवेट करते थे टूल्स को, लोगों के कपड़ों को, वो किस तरह के एग्रीकल्चरल प्रैक्टिसेस को यूज कर रहे थे बेस्ड ऑन द रिमेन्स ऑफ ईदर क्रॉप्स, based on, either remains of seeds. Now these were all material objects, and material objects currently हमारे जो आजकल के contemporary हालात हैं उनके अंदर भी exist करते हैं. अब जिस तरह हमारे जो कपड़े पहनने का स्टाइल है, जो हमारे इर्द गिर्द जो आइटम्स हैं जिनको हम यूज करते हैं, ये सारे मटीरियल ऑब्जेक्ट्स हैं. दे डिफाइन अ कल्चर. नाउ me sitting here, speaking here to you in English, which is a universal language now, me using a computer by virtue of which I can connect to the whole world, is itself a culture. It's the culture of globalization. So essentially what I'm trying to convey to you is that culture has material objects, culture has also non-material objects. If you recall, we also said that archaeologists, by looking at material culture, can give an idea, an indication of how people in the past used to think and behave. In current circumstances, there is no need to do that, because an anthropologist can go into a particular society, observe the behavior of people, talk to them, get an idea of the kinds of ideas that these people hold, and on the basis of that determine non-material aspects of culture. So ये जो non-material aspects हैं culture के, यानी कि लोगों के attitudes, उनके रवैये, उनकी जो belief systems हैं, वो उसका भी एक बहुत बड़ा असर है culture पे, क्योंकि वो influence करते हैं कि इंसान behave कैसे करेंगे, act कैसे करेंगे. So इसलिए जो culture के non-material aspects हैं ये भी बहुत ज़रूरी हैं. एक और अहम चीज़ है कल्चर के बारे में, वो ये है कि कल्चर एक शेयर्ड फिनोमेना है. यानी कि कल्चर जो है वो एक बंदे का कल्चर नहीं होता है. कल्चर जो है वो हजारों लोगों का कल्चर होता है, लाखों लोगों का कल्चर होता है. देयर इज अ कल्चर ऑफ defined by virtue of nationality. As Pakistanis, we all have culture. Culture also exists in the form of smaller groups. There's a particular culture of being a Punjabi, let's say. There's a particular culture of being an urban educated or a foreign educated person. There's a particular culture of being a Muslim, for example. There's a particular culture of cosmopolitan life. अब जो दही इलाके हैं उनका कल्चर जो है, उनका जो द वे दे थिंक, द वे दैट दे value time, the way that they behave is different than people who live in the city. So there are distinct types of culture. Then within a city, I mean, there are different types of culture, but essentially the idea about culture is that culture is a shared phenomena. So people have to share culture. You can't have a culture of an individual. एक बंदे का culture नहीं हो सकता है. I mean, it has to be a phenomena कि एक से ज्यादा लोग, एक छोटा ग्रुप, एक उससे बड़ा ग्रुप, एक उससे बड़ा ग्रुप, यानी कि मिसाल के तौर पर मुसलमानों का एक अपना खसूस जो है वो कल्चर है. सो कल्चर की अहम बात जो है वो ये है कि कल्चर हैज टू बी अ शेयर्ड फिनोमेना, ताकि आपस में जो लोग हैं उनका एक कॉमन कल्चर हो और वो एक दूसरे की बात को समझ सकें ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ दैट कल्चर. अब कल्चरल influences जो हैं, they can be reinterpreted and thus do not yield uniform effects. इसका कहने का ये मतलब है कि कल्चर की जो इन्फ्लुएंसेस हैं वो लाजमी नहीं है कि हमारा जो कल्चर है वो हमारे पर ऐसी इन्फ्लुएंस कर दे कि हमें बेसिकली all of us act exactly in the same manner. That is not possible. I mean, culture, yes, it's true, it influences people to a large degree. It influences the patterns of their behavior, the kinds of ways in which they'll react, their belief systems. But by and large, culture की जो influence है वो हर इंसान जो है, हर इंडिविजुअल जो है वो अपने लिए इंटरप्रेट करता है. सो उससे ये होता है कि कल्चर का जो अफेक्ट है वो हर इंसान के ऊपर थोड़ा सा डिफरेंट होता है. आई मीन, बीइंग अ पाकिस्तानी, ऑल ऑफ अस आर पाकिस्तानीज. नाउ मी बीइंग अ पाकिस्तानी, to me the word Pakistani might trigger off this reaction कि मैं तो पाकिस्तानी हूं क्योंकि मैं तो पान खाता हूं. अब आप अगर अपने आप को पाकिस्तानी समझें तो हो सकता है आप कहें कि जी बरे सगीर में गजलें जो थी वो इंडियन सब कॉन्टिनेंट में जब फिर मुसलमान आए, फ्यूजन हुई ऑफ कल्चर्स, तो एक ये लिटरेरी रिएक्शन था और गजलें बन गई. तो मैं तो जब अपने आप को समझता हूं पाकिस्तानी तो आई लुक एट ऑल these historical influences, their intermingling, their interaction and the production of a ghazal. So that to me defines my nationality, my sense of nationality, and how the idea of ghazal has evolved in the last 50 or so years since 1947, since independence, because ghazal is still a much cherished form of art and culture in Pakistan. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that culture जो है वो हर बंदा जो है, हर इंसान जो है वो अपने लिए इंटरप्रेट करता है, और उसकी वजह से कल्चर जो है वो हर इंसान को एक जैसा नहीं बना देता. Now another important thing about culture is that culture is learned. While humans do have instincts, culture is not transmitted genetically. ये एक काफी अहम पॉइंट है. इसका कहने का ये मकसद है कि कल्चर जो है वो इंसान टू अ सर्टेन डिग्री कल्चर को लर्न करते हैं. आई मीन, हम इसका ये कहने का मतलब नहीं है कि हमारे इंस्टिंक्ट्स नहीं हैं. हर इंसान के इंस्टिंक्ट्स होते हैं, हमारे नेचुरल इंस्टिंक्ट्स हैं, हमें जो कि सीखने नहीं पड़ते. हम जब पैदा होते हैं तो कई इंसान में इंस्टिंक्चुअल चीजें हैं, मगर इसका ये कहने का मतलब नहीं है कि इंसान के जब वो पैदा होता है तो उसके जितने इंस्टिंक्ट्स हैं वो सारे उसके अंदर इम्बाइब्ड होते हैं. आई मीन, कोई भी ऐसा इंसान नहीं है जो इंस्टिंक्चुअली पैदा होकर लर्न्स हाउ टू वॉक, हाउ टू टॉक, हाउ टू स्पीक, व्हाट टू थिंक. दीज आर ऑल एस्पेक्ट्स दैट आर लर्न्ड. सो ये एक बेसिक डिफरेंशिएशन है जो कि इंसान और जानवर में फर्क है. नाउ एन एनिमल इज born with biological instincts that imbibe in it essentially all the attributes, all the major attributes and life coping skills that it needs. अब आप इसकी एक सादा सी मिसाल अगर लें तो if you take 10 or 15 ants and you place them on a deserted island, वहाँ पर आप उनको एक साल छोड़ दें तो you will find these ants which are, let's say, infants. I mean, these ants or some other mammals, they're born and you just transport them to a deserted island. आप उनको वहाँ पर छोड़ दें and you go back, visit the area in 5 years or 10 years and you will see them acting and behaving in all those manners that the rest of their species exhibit. So वो अगर ants हैं तो उन्होंने एक कॉलोनी अपनी, वो जिस तरह एंट्स अपनी कॉलोनी बनाती हैं, उनकी जो हायरार्कीज होती हैं एंट्स की, वो उन्होंने मेंटेन की होंगी. दे विल हैव दिस elaborate maze in which they will live. They will be hunting using similar skills that are evident in the rest of their species. Magar if you take a human being and you try to take 10 or 15 human beings from the most educated families with parents, you know, which have the highest IQ, आप उनके बच्चों को लेके, be it of any color, any race, and you put these 10 or 15 human babies on an island, you will find, you go back in 10 or 15 years, you will find these human beings to be less than savages. They won't, most probably they're not going to have developed a language. I mean, certainly not in 10 or 15 years, that would not have happened. They would be probably talking, if they're still alive, they'll be talking in grunts. They will not know how to use tools. They won't have an understanding of the idea of creating even a fire. So जो इंसान की जितनी advancements हैं, वो in 10 or 15 years, you would see man returning to basically a very, very, very basic level of existence. So what this kind of an example is meant to illustrate is that insan jo hain, they have to learn culture. It's an active, hands-on process by which human beings become who we are. We are not born this way. We just have some basic instincts. Like, agar मैं यहाँ पर खड़ा हुआ and someone throws a brick at me, so I will duck. No one has to tell me कि भाई ये कोई ईंट फेंके अगर तुम्हारी तरफ and ईंट आए तो तुम फिर इस तरह हो. नहीं. That is going to be instinct. ठीक है? But I wouldn't know how to express myself. I wouldn't be dressing in a certain way. I wouldn't be talking in a certain way. I wouldn't know how to operate this machine if I wasn't taught how to do this. So that has been taught to me by virtue of my culture, by virtue of the educational institutions and the other opportunities that I've been able to avail out of this. So having said this, now let me go on and talk about the process of learning by which we get culture. And the process of learning culture is called inculturation, which is similar in process but differs in terms of content. Now inculturation जो है वो हर society में inculturation होती है. People's parents, the educational and political institutions that exist in that particular society, no matter what form they take, have this active process of teaching young children, जो कि infants होते हैं, उनकी तब से training शुरू हो जाती है कि भाई अगर आप let's say कि आप Tanzanian grasslands in Africa में अगर आप एक hunting tribe में पैदा हुए तो आपको life coping skills जो हैं वो पता चलेंगी. आपका जो आपके इर्द गिर्द आपके peers हैं उनके ज़रिए, elders के ज़रिए, जो customs हैं, जो particular तौर तरीके हैं of certain indigenous tribes in Africa, those will be imparted to the infant automatically by virtue of interaction with parents, by virtue of interaction with elders, by virtue of interaction with peers. हम लोगों को भी, if you take a fairly conventional example of someone born in a city in a developing country like Pakistan, I mean, most of us with a certain level of income get the chance to go to school. There we interact with children, we have our own parents who tell us how to sit, how to clean ourselves, how to behave. These are basically things which are taught to us. So this idea is called inculturation. Now, culture is necessary for our survival and affects how we think and act. Now, ये जो idea है culture का, इसको मैं अपने पिछले point के साथ जोड़ता हूँ. उसमें एक तो ये है कि culture जो है हमें हमारे वालिदैन समझा देते हैं. अब depending on our situation, on the circumstances of our parents and the particular societies that we exist in, हमें मुख्तलिफ किस्म की चीज़ें जो हैं वो समझाई जाएंगी. अब अगर मैं टैंजानिया में पैदा हुआ हूँ और मैं अगर टैंजानिया के किसी देहात में रहता हूँ, तो जो मुझे चीज़ें सिखाई जाएंगी, they will be different to the things taught to me if I happen to be born in Los Angeles, let's say, to Japanese parents. So ये जो चीज़ें हैं ये डिफ़र करती हैं. जो कंटेंट है वो डिफ़र करता है, मगर जो कंटेंट के अंदर जो तरीका है समझाने का वो सिमिलर है. हर कल्चर में वालिदैन के थ्रू, पेयर्स के थ्रू और सोशल इंस्टीट्यूशंस एंड कल्चरल इंस्टीट्यूशंस के थ्रू ही इंसान कल्चर को पिकअप करते हैं. और ये जो प्रोसेस है, ये प्रोसेस को सीखने में, मतलब आप ये नहीं कह सकते कि जी इस कल्चर में जो बच्चे हैं वो ज्यादा जल्दी कल्चर पिकअप कर लेते हैं, या उस कल्चर में जो हैं लोग वो कल्चर ज्यादा लेट पिकअप करते हैं. दैट्स नॉट ट्रू. इट्स जस्ट कि आपके जो गिवन हालात हैं उसके मुताबिक इंसान जो हैं, जो अक्लमंदी है इन टर्म्स ऑफ पिकिंग अप कल्चर, दैट इज बाय एंड लार्ज द सेम. इट्स जस्ट द सर्कमस्टांसेस एंड द काइंड्स ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन which is imparted by those circumstances which vary. Now, this idea I want to tie to the idea of culture being necessary for our survival and affecting how we think and act. So, कहने का मतलब ये है कि अगर मेरे circumstances जो हैं वो different हैं, तो I will act and behave differently. यानी कि अगर मैं एक दही इलाके में पैदा हुआ और मेरे माँ बाप किसान हैं, तो मुझे जो चीज़ें सिखाई जाएंगी, they will be different to the things taught to me if my father is a mechanic and I have to grow up and earn an income working in his workshop by fixing cars. So हो सकता है कि मुझे प्लाव के बजाय या खेती बाड़ी या कॉटन पिकिंग के बजाय मुझे हो सकता है रेंच ऑपरेट करनी आती हो by the time I'm 12. Now that is dictated by the socio-economic status of my surroundings. So culture largely depends on the larger circumstances. Culture उस तरह evolve करता है आपके हालात के मुताबिक. So the circumstances influence culture, and that influences what children pick up. Another point is that people from the same culture can predict how others will react due to cultural conditioning. Now, cultural conditioning is this idea that, like we mentioned earlier, that culture is a shared phenomena, and there are many other people who share culture, although they interpret it differently. So people who share the same culture will, by and large, to a great degree, know how the other person will react. They can predict behavior of other people, and that allows them to interact easily with people from their same culture. अब इसकी मिसाल ये है कि आप फर्ज करें जी आप पढ़े हुए हैं एफसी कॉलेज में. नाउ एफसी कॉलेज का एक पर्टिकुलर कल्चर है. अब आपके साथ जो आपके फर्स्ट ईयर, सेकंड ईयर, थर्ड ईयर में स्टूडेंट्स हैं, अब उनके साथ आपका हर रोज उठना बैठना है. या अगर आप कहीं किसी दही इलाके से बिलोंग करते हैं, तो आपका बचपन से आपके जो साथ कॉलीग्स हैं आप उनको जानते हैं. अब when you meet them after 10 years or when you are talking to them in the present, you have the same circumstances. Usually chances होते हैं कि friends के circumstances जो हैं वो similar होते हैं. So that makes it very easy for you to communicate with that person. But जब आप communicate करें with someone else from who has different circumstances, तो तब communication is much more difficult. I mean, if you belong to a rural area and you try to talk to a stranger who comes from the city, या वैसा वर्सा, अगर मैं शहरी हूँ और कोई दही इलाके से कोई बंदा आता है, तो मुझे उसके साथ बात करने में, कम्युनिकेट करने में, बिसाइड्स ये नहीं कि हाय हेलो या ग्रीटिंग्स वगैरह नहीं, बट जरा डीपर कम्युनिकेशन करने में प्रॉब्लम होगा. सो उसकी वजह, उस प्रॉब्लम की वजह ये है कि आवर सर्कमस्टांसेस डिफरेंट, आवर कल्चर्स डिफर. Our circumstances, my circumstances are dictated by life in the city. His circumstances are dictated by life in a rural area. So we have slightly different cultures, which makes it difficult for us to communicate. But when I find someone who went to the kind of school that I went to, who I've known since a while, who has a similar culture to my culture, that makes our communication easy. I mean, to take an even larger example, अगर एक पाकिस्तानी एक और पाकिस्तानी से मिलेगा तो उसका, क्योंकि शेयर्ड कल्चर है, उन दोनों को पता है जी कि ईद क्या होती है और रमज़ान के दौरान खाना नहीं मिलता है. अब अगर यहाँ पर कोई चीनी आ जाए, जो चाइना से कोई बंदा आ जाए जिसको रमज़ान के बारे में इल्म नहीं है, तो ही विल बी टेकन अबैक कि यार खाना क्यों नहीं मिल रहा है, क्योंकि वो हमारा, उसका और हमारा मज़हब मुख्तलिफ है, उसका और हमारा कल्चर मुख्तलिफ है. ही विल नॉट नो नेसेसरली हाउ टू इंटरैक्ट विद अस दैट वेल. So essentially these two people belonging to two different nationalities have been conditioned in a different manner, and because of their cultural conditioning they will have difficulty in communicating. And if we have the same cultural conditioning, be it at the national, sub-national level, we have greater ease in predicting how the other person will act. Now, the other idea that I need to bring your attention to is that of cultural universals. What are cultural universals? Cultural universals include economic systems, systems of marriage and family, educational systems, social control systems, and systems of communication. Now, every society, no matter how different it is from another society, needs to have certain systems in place for it to be able to function. So, हर जो है, हर society जो है, हर culture है, उसमें कई चीज़ें तो होनी ही होनी है. उसमें arrangements have to be made for people to reproduce, and that needs to be done through the marriage contract. So, एक ये system है. एक सिस्टम है कि जी बच्चों ने जो है वो तालीम तो किसी ना किसी तरह तालीम या चीज़ें जो वो लर्न, उन्होंने लाइफ कोपिंग, उनकी जो लर्निंग स्किल्स हैं वो हासिल करनी ही करनी है. सो देयर हैज़ टू बी सम काइंड ऑफ एन एजुकेशनल सिस्टम, फॉर्मल, इनफॉर्मल. देयर हैज़ टू बी एन इकोनॉमिक सिस्टम. देयर हैव टू बी ऑल दीज सिस्टम्स इन प्लेस फॉर अ ह्यूमन बीइंग to be able to function, and these are vital parts of culture. Now, another thing which is a cultural universal and that all cultures are meant to have is that they are able to communicate effectively. And cultures, in order to be able to communicate effectively, need to have a language system. And all cultures have language systems. They can produce different languages, but they need to have systems of communication. Another point is that cultural systems, some cultural systems are seemingly invisible, such as social safety nets. Now, what are social safety nets? Social safety nets are basically mechanisms which are put in place by cultures that protect the weak, that protect those who are old, those who are orphaned, that protect people who have encountered certain problems in life, illness, health, etc. Now, in the West, the most common social safety net is that of insurance. I mean, you go to any industrialized country and how do they cope with, all these problems that human beings encounter in their life? through insurance. Almost everyone has insurance of some kind or another. Now you take a developing country, I mean, you take our own country, for example, and how many people have insurance? Very few. Does that mean that we will not fall ill? Does that mean that, there are no problems that people in Pakistan face? Of course, I mean, there are tons of problems. And how do people cope with them? They cope with them through these informal social safety nets, and that's the extended family. Here, जो families का जो तौर तरीका रख रखाव का जो एक invisible system है, that to a large degree ensures that those who have problems with life are actually able to cope. It might not be a pleasant existence, but they are able to survive by virtue of these networks. Now to an outsider they'll say कि यहाँ तो social safety net ही नहीं है जी कोई, यहाँ पर तो no one has insurance. But they have to realize that there is an invisible insurance, there is a social safety net, I mean, which might not be the most desirable form of a safety net, because the state, if it provides a safety net in the form of insurance, that means lesser burden on a family. But there are these invisible social safety nets. So the point here is that these social safety nets and these cultural systems that are in place might not be necessarily visible. Another point is that the versatility of culture and the versatility of cultural systems illustrates how flexible and adaptable humans are. Now, if you look at these cultural systems that we've spoken about, be it of language, be it of education, be it of social safety nets, I mean, they exist in many forms. So, I mean, you have different types of languages within a country. I mean, you have regional variations. यहाँ पर पश्तो बोलते हैं, पंजाबी बोलते हैं, सराइकी बोलते हैं, बलोची बोलते हैं. सो एक तो वो लोकल लैंग्वेज की वेरिएशन है. फिर आई मीन एट द लार्जर लेवल एशियन कॉन्टिनेंट में कितनी ज़्यादा लैंग्वेजेस हैं जो फ्लरिश करती हैं. सो दिस शोज के इंसान के लैंग्वेज के साथ कल्चर्स अटैच्ड हैं, ट्रेडिशंस अटैच्ड हैं, कस्टम्स अटैच्ड हैं. एंड ये जो वैरायटी है of cultures, traditions, of ways of being in the world, that shows कि इंसान जो है वो कितना versatile है कि उसने अपने इर्द गिर्द अपने circumstances को देख के कैसे कैसे circumstances बनाए हुए हैं, कैसे कैसे cultures बनाए हुए हैं. So this shows the inventiveness, the flexibility of human beings. There are two important aspects I need to draw your attention to within the idea of culture, and they are the adaptive and the dysfunctional or maladaptive features of culture. Human beings rely more on cultural than biological adaptation to adjust to versatile environments. Now, this is not new. We have already spoken about this कि हम ज़्यादातर rely करते हैं rather than biology and genes and instincts, we rely on culture. So, having said that, maladaptive or dysfunctional aspects of culture such as pollution can threaten or damage human environments. Now, एक तो हमारे पास आ गए ऐसे एस्पेक्ट्स जिन पे हम रिलाय करते हैं सोसाइटी में जिंदा रहने के लिए. कल्चर के कई तो बड़े फंक्शनल और ज़रूरी एस्पेक्ट्स हैं जो कि बायोलॉजी के अलावा हमें कोप करना सिखा रहे हैं दुनिया के साथ. वो तो हो गए जी अच्छे फंक्शनल एस्पेक्ट्स. अब साइमल्टेनियसली जो ये पॉइंट 2 है स्क्रीन पर, वो कंसर्न करता है डिसफंक्शनल एस्पेक्ट्स को, यानी कि वो एस्पेक्ट्स जो हमारी इन्वायरमेंट के अंदर ऐसी प्रैक्टिसेस हैं जो हमारी सराउंडिंग्स को हार्म कर रही हैं. मिसाल के तौर पे इतने ज़्यादा डिस्टेंसेस को कवर करने के लिए इंसान ने इजाद की गाड़ी, विच वुड अलाउ easy transport between one place and another. I mean, or a cycle or a motorcycle or the public transport system. But उसको जब population बढ़ गई और concentration geographic areas की जो थी वो dense होती गई, तो नतीजा उसका निकला कि जी pollution जो थी वो इंडस्ट्री भी धुएं छोड़ रही है, pollution कर रही है, chemicals दरियाओं में फेंक रही है, ऊपर से जी खैर से I mean, be it diesel cars or be it, all these other vehicles. I mean, in America they say जो pollution का हाल है वो कोई 40 से 60% जो है pollution को directly transport से जो pollution emit हो रही है वो pollution cause कर रही है. अमेरिका का जो pollution problem है वो 40 से 60% जो है estimated है to be caused by transport problems. So you can have a very useful, seemingly adaptive feature of culture which can become dysfunctional or maladaptive. And pollution जो है वो नतीजा है of lots of cars in a small amount of space that is harming the environment. Now, there are aspects within culture that are integrative. We have to realize that, and this goes back to the first lecture where I had mentioned the idea of anthropology being a holistic discipline. It looks at things, the bigger picture of things. So अब culture भी जो है, culture भी कोई जिस तरह हमने अभी बात की थी कि कोई छोटी मोटी चीज नहीं है कि one person can belong to a particular culture. No. Culture जो है वो groups of people belong to a culture. I mean, be it someone from a rural area, from an urban area, from a developing country, from a Muslim country, be it, the Chinese culture, traditional culture. These are things that groups of people, that populations, segments of populations belong to. So, in that sense, culture is itself, not only does it involve a lot of people, it's an integrative concept. Cultures are logical and coherent systems shaped by particular context. Now, ये जो statement है कि logical system है जो कि circumstances की वजह से culture जो है वो एक circumstances को देखकर एक reaction है, ये एक sophisticated understanding है of culture. I mean कि आप अपने इंसान जो हैं वो अपने हालात को देखकर उसमें जो compulsions हैं हालात की उनको देखकर अपना culture create करता है. I mean, for a cultural anthropologist, this is what culture means. It doesn't mean कि आप गज़लें सुनते हैं या pop music सुनते हैं. That doesn't necessarily constitute culture. They are both examples of culture. Now, various parts of culture are interconnected, yet culture is more than a sum of its parts. अब इसका कहने का मकसद ये है कि कल्चर जो है ये सारी चीजें हैं, वो पॉप म्यूजिक भी है, क्लासिकल म्यूजिक भी है, वो पान भी है, वो दही इलाके में जो बंदा है उसका धोती पहनने का अंदाज भी है, वो लस्सी पीना भी है. दीज आर ऑल एस्पेक्ट्स ऑफ कल्चर. बट कल्चर बीइंग अ पाकिस्तानी is more than only eating a pan, more than only drinking lassi, more than only wearing a dhoti. It is a larger ideological, a larger belief system, a larger way of doing things, a larger mannerism that defines culture. So ये culture के छोटे छोटे जो parts हैं, they make up a bigger sum. और एक चीज जो जरूरी है वो ये है कि कल्चर जो है कल्चर चेंज करता है, कल्चर स्टैग्नेंट नहीं है. जो 500 साल पहले रवायतें थी और कल्चर था, दैट मे नॉट नेसेसरली बी ट्रू इन द प्रेजेंट सर्कमस्टांसेस. सो कल्चर जो है वो हाईली अडेप्टिव है, हाईली फ्लेक्सिबल है और मुख्तलिफ इलाकों के मुख्तलिफ कल्चर्स. अब कल्चर जो है वो इंडिविजुअल उसके साथ कैसे इंटरैक्ट करता है, हाउ डज वन पर्सन रिलेट टू दिस लार्ज thing called culture, this large phenomena called culture. Although culture influences on thoughts, actions and behaviors of individuals, it does not determine them exclusively. This is an important point. Essentially, an individual, no doubt, will be affected by culture. मैं पाकिस्तानी हूँ, पाकिस्तान का जो culture है, जो रवायत है, सकाफत है, that has affected me. But after all, I am an individual. Me and other people, almost everyone else, we tend to pick and choose things within this large phenomena called culture. We pick and choose things that are of our own liking. We pick and choose things by virtue of our circumstances. Me being a Pakistani might have had the opportunity to go to an English medium school, so I can speak the remnants of a colonial language have been adopted by people like us to be able to communicate using this language, which is a universal language now. So I can use this language to express my ideas and thoughts to other people who can also speak this language and are not English. So कहने का मकसद ये है कि अब मुझे तो मेरे हालात ऐसे थे कि मैंने अंग्रेजी सीख ली, अब वो मेरी पाकिस्तानी होने का भी हिस्सा है. मैं एज अ पाकिस्तानी आई कैन ऑल्सो स्पीक इंग्लिश. अब अगर मैं सराइकी बेल्ट में सदर्न पंजाब की पैदा होता तो हो सकता है कि मेरे लिए तो उर्दू बोलना दुश्वारी होती और मैं ज्यादातर बोलता सराइकी. सो दैट इज ऑल्सो एन इंडिविजुअल सर्कमस्टांस जो कि लार्जर एक हमारी colonial legacy and political circumstances and the fact that English is an English language does not affect that person who belongs to the Saraiki belt of, let's say, Rajanpur. That person will not have an opportunity to pick up this particular aspect of culture. And that person will pick up things that I might not have picked up and know things that are part of our heritage and our culture that I don't know. So essentially ये individual का interaction होता है with culture. Having said this, there is a diverse range of individuality to be found within one culture. अब ये जो statement है ये मेरी पिछली बात की वजाहत कर रही है कि क्योंकि culture जो है वो हर बंदा अपने हालात के मुताबिक ट्यून इन करता है culture में और चंद चीज़ें पिक एंड चूज करता है, चंद चीज़ें जो हैं वो हालात की वजह से उसको मिलती हैं, कंपल्शंस होती हैं, अपॉर्चुनिटीज ही उसकी वो होती हैं. सो हर बंदे का जो रिएक्शन है टू कल्चर इज ऑन एन इंडिविजुअल बेसिस. अब एक और चीज ये है कि मोस्ट कल्चर्स आर आल्सो कंप्राइज्ड ऑफ सब कल्चर्स. अब एक ये भी कल्चर में एक और वैरायटी है कि जी कल्चर जो है वो सिर्फ एक बंदे का कल्चर नहीं है, कल्चर के अंदर सब कल्चर्स हैं. अब पाकिस्तानी होने के नाते हमारा एक कल्चर है, लाहौराइट होने के लिहाज से we have another culture, a subculture, that of sort of this a culture of Sassi Punnu, a culture of the Badshai Masjid, a culture of Minare Pakistan, or culture of Gawal Mandi that someone from Karachi will not have. These are all illustrations and examples of various cultural traits, material culture. So essentially ये जो चीजें हैं ये आपको एक वैरायटी, एक फ्लेवर दे रही हैं कि एक इंडिविजुअल कैसे इंटरैक्ट करता है कल्चर के साथ. Having spoken about culture in this large sense and hopefully having given you a certain amount of detail regarding culture, I will now move on to the idea of anthropology. And to move on and talk about the discipline of anthropology, I will speak about applied versus pure anthropology. Now, pure anthropology is concerned with refining methods and theories to obtain increasingly accurate and valid anthropological data. Pure anthropology जो है या जो theoretical anthropology जो है उसका मकसद जो है वो ये है कि जी फील्ड में रिसर्च होए, जाके anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, various cultures के साथ interact करें using different methods. They try to look at the circumstances of people, the ideas that people have, the way people act, and using that information, they fine-tune their own method. They revise their own discipline. ये है theoretical level पर anthropology. Now, एक जो theory है anthropology की, उसके साथ साथ एक applied approach है to anthropology. And वो है कि applied anthropologists जो हैं, they aim to understand and recommend changes in human behavior to alleviate contemporary problems. अब जो applied anthropologist है वो ये करता है कि वो हालात का जायजा लेकर he tries to have a hands-on approach and tries to change various things about a culture to make the lives of people easier. So it's a much more interactive, hands-on approach using the knowledge of anthropology to try and change to try and change circumstances, to try and affect circumstances to have more positive outcomes for the people who belong to those systems, to those cultures. इसको कहते हैं the problem oriented approach और ये problem oriented research कहलाती. अब anthropologists can apply anthropological data, concepts and strategies to the solution of socio-economic, political problems facing different cultures. So anthropologist जो है वो अपना knowledge, उसका जो एक तरीका है to be unbiased, to be able to probe circumstances, ये नहीं कि surface level पर लोगों के हालात के जायजे ले लिए and be judgmental about them, but to really try and attempt to understand where people are coming from, why they have certain beliefs, why they act in a certain manner, why they hold a certain culture, why they have these certain traditions. उस knowledge को use करते हुए anthropologists जो हैं वो मसले हल कर सकते हैं उन लोगों के. These problems can range from socio-economic conditions. It could be कि जी इस community में violence बहुत ज़्यादा है. It could be कि इस community में poverty बहुत ज़्यादा है, इस community में crime ज़्यादा है. तो they will look at the circumstances behind these apparent problems, these apparent systems that afflict people. They will probe their culture, they will look at the way these people think, their larger circumstances that are driving them to exhibit these problems. I mean, like I said, the problem of poverty, of crime, of violence. So इनकी hands-on problem solving approach जो है anthropologists की, cultural anthropologists की, that can help people change their circumstances, live better, cope with their circumstances. Now, anthropologists can focus on development, research or advocacy to help improve the human condition. So anthropologists या तो वो research कर सकते हैं या वो जाकर लोगों के हालात के बारे में advocacy कर सकते हैं, policy makers को समझा सकते हैं कि जी लोगों के हालात इस तरह इस वजह से हैं, आप इसके ऊपर जोर दें जी policy makers. So ये जो anthropologists हैं इनका पिछले 15, 20, 30 सालों में काफ़ी influence बढ़ गया है. जिस तरह मैंने आपको mention किया था कि मैंने भी कुछ research की हुई है इन issues पर, and one has been able to use the anthropological approach to approach particular problems, to look at the way how people think and act and behave and their circumstances. So given this serious nature of problems and issues that cultural anthropologists to deal with in a hands-on approach, problem-solving approach, it is necessary for them to have an ethical approach to their own discipline and to their research. So there are ethical implications for anthropologists who go and work with people who are experiencing problems by virtue of their circumstances. And for an anthropologist, having a hands-on approach, a problem-solving approach, needs to consider that they have an important role to play, and they have to have an ethical manner in approaching a particular problem, and there are ethical implications of their work, and they have to, so these cultural anthropologists have to be responsible to the people who are being studied. Biggest ethical implication for cultural anthropologists, they have a responsibility towards the people that they are studying. They have a responsibility to the discipline of cultural anthropology, to their own field. They owe something to their field because they represent their field. They owe responsibility to their sponsors. I mean, often a cultural anthropologist will be hired by someone, by a non-government organization, by a government organization. They have a sense of responsibility to their own and to their host governments. If an anthropologist from abroad comes here to do something, that anthropologist has a responsibility not only to their own government but to our government, because they are working for the Pakistani people. They're trying to, let's say, look at the implications of building a dam in the country. So they could be looking at the cultural patterns of people who will be affected by the construction of the dam. So these are ethical implications. They cannot betray, a cultural anthropologist cannot betray the trust of the people that they study. They cannot betray their own governments. They cannot betray people who hire them. They cannot betray their own discipline. And these are serious issues that are, are being spoken about here. So this will basically bring me to the conclusion of the second lecture. I do hope that you have found this lecture to be interesting, and the attempt here has been to try and continue with the broad introduction of the discipline of anthropology, to try and explain what cultural anthropology is, what are the major issues that are dealt with in cultural anthropology. Today's lecture was a particular attempt in continuation of the previous lecture to try and zone in on this idea of culture, which is the basic bottom line issue that cultural anthropologists deal with. I have also tried to give you a basic understanding of the idea of the problem-solving approach in anthropology and its difference from the theoretical approach. And in subsequent lectures, we will be discussing these issues in greater detail. The next lecture is going to be talking about the particular important theories within cultural anthropology. And until then, I will take leave and wish you the best of luck. Khuda Hafiz.